Well, everyone, here we are almost a month after the RTX 3080 launch and just a few weeks after the RTX 3090 with this, the RTX 3070. And I'm pretty sure you guys are excited for this because this thing is a lot more important for NVIDIA than the other two flagships because it's the most affordable option or alternative that they have that might compete against the RX 6000 series that AMD is about to announce tomorrow. Well, at least that's the expectation. Because we technically don't know where those new Radeon GPUs will land. Now, I'm pretty sure your sub boxes are filled with RTX 3070 reviews, so we're committed to give you something a little bit different. So first, we'll walk you through what exactly you need to know about the RTX 3070 in terms of pricing, availability, and specs. And then we'll follow our usual benchmarks, testing this thing on our current high-end system at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. But the majority of this video will follow the same footsteps as our RTX 3080 review. So basically, how much of a performance increase you're getting with the 3070 on an older system. So we'll be testing this thing on a 7700K and a GTX 1080 Ti, and a 1070 Ti. So let's get into all of that right after a message from our sponsor.
The new Pure Loop all-in-one coolers from Be Quiet have a doubly decoupled pump near the radiator for silent operation and flexibility for mounting, an elegant cooling block with pure white illumination, an accessible fill port on the radiator with liquid for future proofing, and Pure Wings 2 fans on the rad. Check it out below.
Alright, so on paper at least, the RTX 3070 is cut down by a lot from the RTX 3080. And that, my friends, leaves plenty of room for NVIDIA to launch cards that bridge the gap. It has 5,888 CUDA cores with an engine clock of 1730 MHz. There's also 8GB of GDDR6 memory operating on a 256-bit interface at 14 gigabits per second. But that cut down core and slower memory speeds also causes a pretty big power reduction compared to the 3080, so you'll be able to get away with a lower spec PSU between 600 and 650 watts. In many ways, the RTX 3070 can be considered a natural replacement for the 2070 Super, which was technically launched at $500, even though it was impossible to find one for that price. Naturally, it has more cores, ROPs, and texture units, not to mention all the improvements NVIDIA's done with their second generation ray tracing architecture. Another thing that's going to be interesting to see is availability. Supposedly, NVIDIA delayed the launch for this GPU to build up more stock after the RTX 3080 fiasco. So they expect this thing to go on sale on October the 29th. Now, the big question is whether or not if demand will outstrip supply. And it looks like that's probably going to be the case. So finding a 3070 isn't going to be easy. Now, one last thing, and this is super important, is that NVIDIA is no longer planning on selling the Founders Edition GPU on their official website. They've actually assigned that task to a few retailers. So if you're in the United States, you can get the FE at Best Buy or Micro Center. Or if you're here in Canada, it's a Best Buy exclusive. Now, taking a look at the overall design of the Founders Edition, I have to say this again, this is simply the best looking RTX 3070 around. And it's only 9.5 inches long, so it's the perfect size for ITX systems. While this looks like a downdraft style cooler, it's actually not. The fan closest to the I/O area intakes cool air and then it immediately pushes it out the back, while the other fan pushes cool air through the heatsink and right out the other side, so there's a new PCB there. That means the actual card is only about 6 inches long. But in order to get to that size, NVIDIA needed to use their new mini 12-pin power connector. And while you still get a dongle with the Founders Edition, it still looks pretty terrible. Luckily, some manufacturers like Corsair have begun releasing native 12-pin cables for their PSUs, which look a lot cleaner. Alright, so with that quick tour out of the way, let's dive into the benchmarks with our usual Core i9-10900K test system, but we're going to be doing this a little bit differently. Since there are 3 different resolutions, each set of test results will be followed by a performance summary and analysis. We're also going to be adding an RTX 2080 Super and an RTX 2070 Super. So, let's get started. So at today's most popular resolution, the 3070 does exactly what NVIDIA said it would, in most cases, and that's to deliver performance that's within a few percentage points of the RTX 2080 Ti. The big takeaway here is that some games are CPU limited at 1080p. So if you're playing at this resolution and you have a RTX 2070 Super, there's really no reason to grab a 3070 right now. Even the RTX 3080 is only about 18% better than the 3070, which does make the cheaper card look like a pretty good value. Now let's cut to 1440p testing. So 1440p really seems like the sweet spot for the RTX 3070 since both its 1% lows and average frame rate leads get extended against the RTX 2080 Super and RTX 2070 Super, even though both of those cards are slightly overclocked by board partners. Here it's basically a clone of the RTX 2080 Ti's performance. At the same time, the RTX 3080 stays way ahead, which is about 25% since its lead is getting even bigger with the CPU bottleneck being removed in some games. Now on to 4K. Now, while the 3070 isn't specifically marketed as a 4K gaming GPU, it can get the job done pretty well, all things considered. And yes, the RTX 2080 Ti and 3080 get further out front, but at the same time, the 3070 also moves further ahead of the Supers as well. At least in the games we benchmarked, it doesn't seem like 8GB is going to be a limiting factor for 4K gaming, at least not yet in most titles. As for power consumption, well, we already knew from NVIDIA's numbers that the RTX 3070 wasn't going to be sipping electricity. But the interesting thing here is its peak power consumption ended up being between the 2080 Super and the 2070 Super, which gives it much better performance per watt ratio than either of those. It's also quite a bit more efficient than the RTX 2080 Ti, so that's nice. Temperatures over time were pretty much as expected since NVIDIA's thermal engineering team seems to have found the secret sauce with their new cooler design. But what about clock speeds? Well, those were super stable too. As a matter of fact, it stayed well above the on-paper specs for the entire test. And that's good news since you can be confident that the RTX 3070 will continue to deliver pretty much identical performance over the course of a gameplay session. Now, it doesn't get to these levels with higher noise either since it stayed super quiet on our open test system. It's actually quieter than the 3080. Well, that pretty much wraps up this part of our coverage, and I have to say that the RTX 3070 delivers better performance at less power compared to the RTX 2080 Super. Now, I wouldn't go out and buy a 3070 if I already have an RTX 2000 Super Series GPU though, and that's because this doesn't give you a dramatic or substantial performance uplift like the 3080 did relative to its price. For example, the 3080 is about 45% faster than the 2080 Super despite launching for the same $700 price point. On the other hand, the RTX 3070 gives you roughly 25% higher frame rates than the RTX 2070 Super, and both those cards cost around $500. Now, it could be that adding ray tracing could change the equation, but that's something that we'll have to test out in a separate video. And speaking of the RTX 3080, it's pretty obvious NVIDIA left a massive performance hole between it and the RTX 3070, so they could drive another GPU into that lineup. But I also have to wonder if that hole will give AMD the opportunity that they need for the RX 6000 series. I guess that's something that we'll have to find out soon, which we will, because they're announcing it tomorrow. So what you saw earlier is basically a comparative performance results against GPUs that were launched in the last 18 months or so. But what they didn't cover is the current situation that we know a lot of you guys are in, and that's something that we read from the comments in our RTX 3080 coverage. Most of you guys are not rocking 9900Ks, Zen 2s, or 10900Ks in your system. In fact, most of you might have probably skipped those CPUs. In fact, you might have skipped the RTX 2000 series, or even the RX 5700 series of GPUs. Back in the RTX 3080 launch day coverage, we took a chance and included the i7 7700K along with older GPUs in our video. Well, based on the positive feedback we got, it's happening again. This time we're going down the same road, but we're adding 1080p testing as well as including a GTX 1070 Ti. Remember, that was an important GPU too because it was launched around $450. So Naturally, the upgrade path would be something like the RTX 3070. We'll also be including the 3070 with the 10900K just so you get a frame of reference regarding whether or not the older CPU is causing a bottleneck. Other than that, the test systems are completely identical right down to the storage drives being used. Starting at 1080p, and right away we can see a trend develop in some titles, and that's the 7700K becoming a bottleneck sometimes. To the point where an RTX 3070 paired up with a 10900K will beat an RTX 3080 7700K combo. Not only that, but the difference between the fastest and slowest GPUs at this setting is super narrow. But there are also plenty of games that aren't CPU constrained, and whether you run into one of those situations, the RTX 3070 is able to pull really far ahead of the older GPUs, while the RTX 3080 could still be CPU limited. Another possibility at 1080p is much higher 1% lows on a system equipped with a more modern CPU like the 10900K. Overall, there can be huge benefits when upgrading from a GTX 1080 or GTX 1070 Ti, even at this resolution. Yet, at the same time, there's also a very real situation of diminishing returns in some games. On the other hand, I wouldn't buy an RTX 3080 to play at 1080p on a 3-year-old system. You're much better off saving some money for a whole system upgrade. Moving to 1440p, it's a very different story, guys. Sure, there's still a bit of bottlenecking, but the more powerful cards are now starting to stretch their legs. As a matter of fact, the delta between the 10900K and 7700K systems is virtually non-existent in most situations. We already saw this in our RTX 3080 video, and it's the same here. Unlike the 1080p results, at 1440p, you could pop one of those GPUs into your system and be confident it'll provide an amazing overall gaming experience compared to what you currently have. Add a new SSD into that equation for your game drive and you'll have a snappy system that'll almost feel like new. It's really amazing to see how GPU-bound games are these days, but that's understandable. CPU performance has been moving at a slow pace, so developers have looked towards graphics processors to execute more in-game tasks other than just rendering. What I said about 1440p gets doubled down at 4K. The RTX 3070 just walks all over older GPUs, offering double or sometimes even close to triple the frame rates. While I'm not sure how many of you are going to pair up an expensive 4K screen with a 3-year-old system, at least you now know there's an option for an incremental system upgrade rather than just buying a whole new setup. Something else jumps out with these results though. At 4K, the GTX 1080 Ti is able to hang right in there in some games. It isn't super competitive in every situation, but it just goes to show Nvidia's flagship from 2017 does still have some fight left. So I guess it's time to wrap this up. From a system upgrade perspective, the RTX 3070 is a pretty good value, provided you're playing at 1440p or higher. When you get down to 1080p though, spending $500 on a new GPU before other upgrades might not be a good idea. Also remember that these observations can only be applied to gaming, since moving to a more modern platform has positive impacts in a lot of other places like rendering times. But should you jump into the RTX 3070 right now? Look, I think this card is being launched at the right price to performance ratio based on the current market right now. But that market can change overnight after AMD's announcement tomorrow. So I'm going to sign off by saying that most of you guys probably have a good enough GPU that will get you by until the dust settles off, and of course when the stock situation for this GPU gets better. But if you absolutely positively need a drop-in upgrade for 1440p gaming, and if you don't like spending 3080 money, 3070 it is. It's the best option that's available right now. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. Let us know what you guys think about our coverage. And yeah, finally, spend responsibly.